Well, there are probably millions of people this morning that are thinking about Christ's resurrection more than they normally do, because today is the day that is commonly known as Easter. Some people complain that Easter is a Christianized adaptation of a pagan holiday worshiping a goddess named Ishtar. Some people say that Easter originated with the Roman Church with Constantine around 400 AD. Some people say that Easter has been being celebrated under the name of Christian Passover by Christians since the 2nd century, soon after Jesus. What I do know for certain is that it's good that a lot of people are thinking about Christ, and it's good for us to think about him, especially on this day, but also every day, and to find something special to think about every day in regards to Christ. So I'd like to think about his resurrection as well this morning. First of all, Christ's resurrection gives us evidence for our faith. His resurrection is a literal historical event that we have records of that can actually serve as evidence for Christianity. And you will see that, for instance, Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-6, "I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom remain until now, but some have fallen asleep. And we know that the letter from Paul to the Corinthians was written not long after Jesus himself lived and died on the earth. And we know that when he said 500 people saw Jesus risen at one time, and most of them are still alive, that this was an invitation for anyone who wanted to investigate this situation, that there were literally people that they could talk to that had seen the risen Christ. So that the Bible isn't just something that we can just assume to be true on blind faith, but there is some historical evidence for it as well. And we have all these writings that are collected in the Bible that are records of his life and of his death, burial, and resurrection. And we have extra-biblical sources that record Jesus' existence. And we also have the fact that all of a sudden, thousands and thousands of Jews were becoming Christians, and then thousands and thousands of pagans were becoming Christians, and that these men, the apostles, and so many of their followers were willing to die for the truth that Jesus had risen from the dead. And that the most plausible and reasonable explanation as to why all of these people would be willing to die for this truth is because they saw Christ risen from the dead. They knew it to be true. They believed it. And so in that sense, when you look at something like 1 Corinthians, this ancient document written in the 1st century, clearly saying, hey, all of these people saw Jesus risen from the dead, you find that Christ's resurrection as a historical event is evidence for our faith. And there's a lot of research that can be done if you're interested in knowing more about that. You see also that Peter, in 2 Peter 1:16, says, "For we did not follow cleverly devised tales when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty." So once again, he's emphasizing that he saw it himself. He lived in that time, and that explains what he was willing to go through on Christ's behalf at the early days of the church. Then you've got John in 1 John chapter 1 and verse 1 saying, "What was from the beginning, what we have seen, or what we have heard, what we have seen with our eyes, what we have looked at and touched with our hands concerning the word of life." So all of these men who are writing the Gospels and writing the books of our Bible had seen Jesus for themselves and had seen him after his death and burial to know that he had resurrected. And that is a powerful testimony. There are many who, argue that Jesus never existed as a historical figure, but I believe they do so for their own personal reasons, maybe emotional reasons. But anytime you've got as much evidence for someone existing in the ancient world as Jesus, none of the other people with as much evidence are ever argued that way. There's a lot of evidence for his existence and even for his resurrection, as explaining how the early church came to be and how all of these writings came to be, and they made these claims and were believed by so many individuals. So that's sort of a baseline starting point to think that Christ's resurrection is a real event that really happened, that there's evidence for. And I believe that it also gives our existence meaning, which is obviously a very big claim. You will notice in Ecclesiastes, I believe that Ecclesiastes was written probably by Solomon's friends as a way to commemorate his life. And if you look at what they wrote about him, or by these people that wrote about Solomon, it's a very certain kind of literature in which it appears he's describing the whole world but leaving God out of the picture. So that this life, from the time you live to the time you die, is all that there is. And in that picture, he says, "Vanity of vanities," says the preacher, "vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What advantage does man have in all his work which he does under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. That which has been is that which will be, and that which has been done is that which will be done. There is no remembrance of earlier things, and also of the later things which will occur. There will be for them no remembrance among those who will come still later." There's this kind of hopeless picture that, people live and die and the world remains the same, and no one even remembers the lives of those who came 1,000 years before them. And it's a very bleak picture. And it's a kind of picture that actually became very popular for people to paint later in the history of the world, when people really in large numbers started believing that there was no God and that there was nothing after death. But you see that kind of a picture painted long before in Ecclesiastes. And the beautiful thing about Ecclesiastes is you have Solomon going around looking at everything, leaving God out of the picture, or leaving life after death out of the picture at least, and saying how pointless it all seems, and then at the end of the book bringing God into the picture. And it makes for a very interesting and powerful lesson. And that's why I believe Christ's resurrection is what gives existence or meaning, because his resurrection showed us that there is life after death, that death isn't the end, that it isn't just like before you were conceived, after you die, but that there is a resurrection and there is more that follows that gives everything that we have meaning. And Paul really comments on this in 1 Corinthians 15. He says, "If there is no resurrection of the dead, not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is vain. Your faith also is vain." So, first of all, he's saying, look, if Christ didn't rise from the dead, then it's pointless to be a Christian. Our preaching is vain. Your faith is vain. He says, if Christ has not been raised, your faith is worthless. You are still in your sins. And then he even says in verse 33, "If the dead are not raised, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die." In other words, let us do whatever we want to do because it doesn't make any difference. And we're just sort of pushing away the knowledge that nothing is following and that we won't remember anything that we do. And philosophers who actually believed that there was nothing after death had to try to come up with some way not to go crazy. So, for instance, Friedrich Nietzsche was one philosopher who he didn't believe in God, so he had to figure out, why am I going to do the right thing instead of the wrong thing, or how am I going to find meaning in life? And his answer was to imagine that he was going to live his exact life over and over and over and over again, an infinite amount of times. And so he would say, well, if I had to do that, how would I want to live today? Ultimately, that answer wasn't sufficient for him because he went crazy and he ended up being institutionalized, and he just lost his mind. A lot of people who don't believe in life after death don't go crazy, but it's probably because they don't actually realize the implications the way that he did so fully, and they don't insist on living that way as he did. in an odd way, being a man of principle and wanting to follow his beliefs is what drove him to that kind of despair. And that's a very extreme portrayal of the truth that Christ's resurrection, which shows us life after death, gives our existence meaning. So you see in 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 10, Peter saying, "You once were not a people, but now you are the people of God. You had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy." In so many ways, what Christ did, not only by demonstrating the reality of the resurrection from the dead, but also by extending mercy to us, gave our lives new meaning, so that we as individuals would not be a people, but now we can be the people of God, who have a purpose and a direction, and who have meaning, who have something to strive for, who have a big picture to fit our lives into. And a lot of these thoughts center around the idea of living and dying and life after death. But I believe also that Christ's resurrection gives us a blueprint for spiritual growth right now, while we live on the earth. And I'd like to read from Romans chapter 6. And normally we read from Romans chapter 6 and think specifically about baptism and the moment of baptism and what happens in that moment. But I'd like you to look at the context here. So Paul says in Romans chapter 6, verse 1, "Are we to continue in sin so that grace may increase?" And he's talking to people who, many of them, have been baptized. So whatever happens in that moment has happened for them. And yet he's asking them, should we continue to sin so that grace may increase? And in response to that, he says, certainly not. And he gives this explanation. He says, "We have been buried with him through baptism into death, so that as Christ was raised from the dead through the glory of the Father, so we too might walk in newness of life. For if we have become united with him in the likeness of his death, certainly we shall also be in the likeness of his resurrection." And he concludes in verse 12, "Therefore do not let sin reign in your mortal body, so that you obey its lusts." So when we're baptized, we're reenacting the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Christ. And that gives us hope that when we die, we also can be resurrected to a new spiritual life. But it also has implications, as Paul shows here in this context, for the way we live each day. He was asking, should we sin in our daily lives? Certainly not, because we're dying with Christ. We're putting to death those parts of ourselves that are selfish and that are sinful in order to walk in a new way and live a new kind of life. So don't let sin reign in your mortal body. And so the picture that he shows us, the blueprint that we see in his death, burial, and resurrection, is a picture we can live out each and every day by putting to death what is selfish in us, what is rebellious towards God in us, what is sinful, by putting to death sin that reigns in our bodies through lusts. And what he's saying is when you put to death those things, you make way for something new. That as Christ died and then he lived, so we can put to death sin in our lives and then live new lives that are better and that are different. And so in Romans 12, for instance, he says, "I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship." That is, that while you are living, you be putting to death self and the sins that are in you. And in that way, you are portraying Christ's own sacrifice that he made and living a new life now. So that's something I hadn't thought a lot about, but putting that blueprint to place in our lives. And it makes me think of what Jesus said in John 12, verse 24. He said, "Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit." And probably the apostles didn't realize what he was talking about, because when he died on the cross and was buried for us and was raised up and brought forth much fruit, they didn't seem to understand what was happening. But it seems that he was foreshadowing his own death and the pain that he would go through, and showing that first that death occurs, and that after that happens, much fruit comes from it, and something even better comes in the end. And that's something that I like to remember. I like to think of this verse in times when obeying God is difficult. And I believe that if we are dedicated to following God, that there will be things that are required of us that are very difficult. I believe sometimes that obeying God is painful. At least it sometimes is for me. And you think about this, his own example that he gave. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. If you're willing to put to death in you whatever it is that you must put to death, if it's your pride or your lust, whatever it may be, then you'll bear much fruit. Something new will come after it. I appreciate the way that it tells us not only about our future, which is so important, but also about what we can do today when we look at his death, burial, and resurrection. And I believe his resurrection gives us courage to fight in that daily battle. So you read things like Ephesians 6:10 through 12. It says, "Finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the full armor of God so that you will be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places." Now, I read this first just to establish the fact that there is a kind of Christian warfare that is going on, that there is a battle that is being fought, and that Paul shows that we're up against some very strong forces. So think with me, why would Christ's resurrection give us the courage to fight? Well, you remember when Christ died on the cross, he said, "It is finished," as if he had accomplished what he came to accomplish, that he had been victorious. And then when he rose from the grave, he showed everyone, his enemies and his friends, that he had been victorious over sin and over death. And think about going into battle already knowing ahead of time that your side is going to win. You know, military tacticians know that in a battle, especially in ancient warfare, if two groups are coming against each other, the only factor is not how big each group is in terms of how many men they have or what kind of weapons. A big factor is what their mindset is. Who's going to retreat first? Are they confident that they can win? And imagine a group going to battle already knowing, with no doubt, my side wins this fight. And that's what Christ demonstrated when he rose from the dead, that God had already overcome sin and death, and that he was willing, totally willing, to extend grace and mercy to anyone who would trust and obey him, so that we know if we stay with God that we will win that fight. I believe that gives us a lot of confidence. He says in 1 Corinthians 16:13, "Be on the alert, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong." And Paul said to Timothy, "God has not given us a spirit of timidity, but of power and love and discipline." And these are the kinds of phrases that you would expect to see in some movie that guys like to watch, of some battle, you know, where one man is encouraging the others to be strong and to fight. You know, the reality of being a Christian, when we understand it, is that there is a lot that is required of us, that there are difficult times, that it is going to require us to totally go after the prize and submit ourselves to God. And it's so much easier, I believe, to do this when you know that you have the necessary resources on your side, when you know that what God asks is for you to submit to him, and that he has the power to win when you will do that. That as long as you stay with him, you don't have to worry. And then we see in Romans 8:16 and 17, another one of my favorite verses, we read, "The Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are children of God, and if children, heirs also, heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, if indeed we suffer with him, so that we may also be glorified with him." In other words, the Spirit reminds us that we are children of the King who wins the battle. He reminds us that we're children of God and that God is victorious. And he says, if children, heirs. heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ. Reminds us that we will be heirs to the prize of heaven, that it has been secured for us. And then he says, if indeed we suffer with him, so that we may also be glorified with him. A lot of this talk of warfare and battle in a spiritual sense as a Christian involves suffering. And it's in those moments of suffering that I believe we need the Spirit to remind us that we're children of a victorious King and that we are heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ if we suffer with him alongside us, so that we may also be glorified with him. And as we move towards a close, I'd like to offer an extended invitation with this final point for us to think about how we can respond to Christ's resurrection. I believe that when you think about Christ already demonstrating God's victory over sin and over death for any who will side with him, that because of that, Christ's resurrection means that no one can keep me out of heaven but myself. We've noticed in Revelation 3:8 before that God says, I have put before you an open door which no one can shut. Jesus himself has opened the doors of heaven for us in a way that no one can shut them. And he said to Peter in Matthew 16:18, upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overpower it. He already knew that he was going to secure victory, and he already knew that no one could keep us out if we ourselves would choose to go in. So you read in Romans 8:31, if God is for us, who is against us? Or as some translations say, who can be against us? If God, who is victorious, who is the most powerful, is on our side, who can be against us? I believe the only ultimate answer, though some can try to be against us, the only ultimate answer is ourselves. And James 4:7-8 says, resist the devil and he will flee from you. Draw near to God and he will draw near to you. Not because we have this great power within ourselves to make the devil flee from us, but because we have the option of being on the side of the Christ who did rise from the grave already. And that brings us to Acts 8:36 that we can think about together. When the Ethiopian eunuch was studying the book of Isaiah, he didn't know what he was reading. He couldn't understand it. And Philip came and explained it to him, maybe in the course of a few minutes or a few hours, less than one full day. And this Ethiopian eunuch came to understand the gospel, and is repeatedly the case in the book of Acts. As soon as someone understands the gospel, they want to be baptized. And you see it happening again and again. That understanding of what the gospel really teaches was a prerequisite that came first. But when they understood it, they always wanted to do it. And it's just the same way with the Ethiopian eunuch. So he said, look, water, what prevents me from being baptized? And they didn't find an answer to that question, so he was baptized that very day. He made that decision. And I don't believe that anything prevented him from being baptized, provided he understood the gospel and was willing to count the costs and submit to it. But if he had been unwilling, then what would have prevented him would have been his own choice not to obey the gospel. But I'd like to encourage us not just to look at this as an issue of baptism, because there are so many things that God asks us to do. We talked about how every day is a battle and how every day is an opportunity to put to death our sins. So not only what prevents me from being baptized, but what prevents me from doing any good thing? What prevents me from getting rid of any sins that remain in my life? Or what prevents me from going out and doing any good deed that I think that God really would like for me to do? It must be ourselves that we don't want to, or we're afraid to. We're not comfortable with it, or we're apathetic and don't think that it really matters, or we don't have a healthy fear of God to take his word seriously. Christ's resurrection means that no one can keep us out of heaven but ourselves, and no one can prevent us from sharing in his victory if we will choose to do so. And so this morning, with that being said, if you would like to make that personal choice, either to be baptized into Christ or to ask for prayers or for help in any other way in following his will and sharing in his victory, then you can come together, come forward as we stand and sing.